Ever heard of Heritage USA? It was this massive Christian theme park back in the 80s. Like, it was huge. Even rivaled Disneyland for a bit. And you wouldn't believe who was behind it all. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. Yeah, the televangelist power couple.
Wow.
But their story is not just about theme parks. It's a wild ride of humble beginnings, a global empire, and then a crash you wouldn't see coming.
Sounds intense.
It is. So today we're going to dive deep into the world of televangelism scandal and this really surprising story of a woman named Jessica Hahn.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that name.
You provided some fascinating excerpts from the You're Wrong About podcast.
Oh, I love that show.
It's a great one.
Right.
Well, they had Jessica Chastain on.
Yeah.
You know, there's actress.
Oh, sure. She played Tammy Faye in the movie.
Exactly. The Eyes of Tammy Faye.
Yeah.
And through those conversations, we're going to explore not just the Bakkers' rise and fall, but also the media frenzy around the whole thing.
The media played a huge role in that whole story.
Absolutely. So let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. You wouldn't believe how different their early lives were compared to the lavish lifestyle they became known for later on.
It's true. Both Jim and Tammy Faye, they came from really humble backgrounds. I mean, Tammy Faye, she was the oldest of 8 kids, grew up in International Falls, Minnesota.
Minnesota, wow.
And they were really poor. Like, baths were a once-a-week thing. They had to heat water on the stove just to do that.
Wow. That's a world away from the opulence of Heritage USA.
You can say that again. And Jim's childhood, it was no picnic either. He grew up in Muskegon, Michigan. And he was really affected by this tragic accident when he was a kid. He accidentally ran over a child.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And he talked about it a lot later on about how it led him to a deeper commitment to God. But some people saw it as a sign of him being kind of self-centered, you know?
It's interesting how a traumatic event can have such a profound impact on someone's faith.
For sure.
And it was during this time that both Jim and Tammy Faye found solace in Pentecostal Christianity. Now, for those who might not be familiar, this isn't your typical Sunday service.
Right. It's much more charismatic and experiential, you know, like speaking in tongues where people utter these sounds that are supposed to be divinely inspired.
Oh, wow.
And even in some cases, snake handling. It was a really vibrant and emotional kind of faith. And both Jim and Tammy Faye, they were drawn to it.
So they meet at Bible college, sparks fly, and it's a whirlwind romance.
3 dates. That's all it took for Jim to pop the question.
When you know, right?
That's what they say.
Yeah.
Well, Tammy Faye, coming from her background, she saw Jim's family as practically royalty. They had 2 indoor bathrooms, a dishwasher, stuff she had never seen before.
Wow.
So you could say it was love, ambition, and maybe a little bit of naivete all mixed together.
And those seeds and ambition, they really took root and grew into something much bigger. But before we get to that, we got to talk about the puppet.
Oh, yeah, Tammy Faye and her puppets.
Tammy Faye's personality was just so bubbly. And those puppets, Susie Moppet and Allie the Alligator, they were a big part of their early success on Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network.
The puppets were huge. They were pioneers in using entertainment to spread their message. And Jim, with his entrepreneurial mind, he saw the potential of television right away. This was the beginning of the TV age, and they were right there at the forefront.
It's amazing how they were shaping the whole landscape of religious broadcasting.
It wasn't just preaching. It was entertainment with a message. They were like America's Christian couple next door.
And that relatability, I think that's what really contributed to their appeal.
Absolutely. Their shows had this genuine warmth, and Tammy Faye's energy was just infectious. They tackled real-life issues, too. They even had someone with AIDS on their show in 1985.
That's right. At a time when even the president was hesitant to even talk about the epidemic.
It was a big deal, and Tammy Faye's compassion in that interview, it was really remarkable, especially considering how conservative the religious landscape was back then.
But even with all that success, there were signs of trouble brewing, weren't there?
Oh, yeah, Jim's fundraising tactics. They were starting to raise some eyebrows.
How so?
He'd always paint this picture of PTL being on the verge of financial ruin, like they were always about to go under.
Really?
Yeah. So people wondered, was it genuine need or was it just pure ambition fueling those pleas for money? Because while they were preaching humility and sacrifice, their own lifestyle was getting more and more extravagant. And then there was Heritage USA. It was their big dream, this massive Christian theme park in Fort Mill, South Carolina.
Heritage USA.
2,300 acres. Huge. It wasn't just a park, though. It was like a statement, a testament to their ambition.
I see.
I mean, they had everything. A water park,
Yeah.
a replica of Jerusalem, even an upper room where people thought miracles could happen.
It sounds like a fascinating and strange mix.
Oh, it was. And people loved it. They sold over 100,000 lifetime memberships, made millions.
Man.
But their financial model, It was a mess. They were promising more hotel nights than they actually had rooms for.
Yeah.
It was all going to come crashing down eventually.
It sounds like it. And this financial instability, combined with some of Jim Bakker's behavior, it all eventually led to their downfall. But before we get to that, let's talk about Jessica Hahn.
Okay.
How did this young church secretary get involved with Jim Bakker, and how did it all impact their empire?
Well, the story that gets told a lot, the one about her being a homewrecker, a seductress, it's way too simple.
Yeah.
Jessica Hahn was a young, devout fan of PTL, and she was lured into a situation she never could have imagined.
Right.
And John Wesley Fletcher, Jim Bakker's associate, he played a big part in all of this.
So Fletcher was involved too.
Oh, yeah. He basically groomed Hahn, preyed on her faith and her desire to be part of PTL.
This is awful. And it's in a hotel room in Clearwater, Florida, where things take a dark turn.
Right. That's where Jim Bakker sexually assaulted her. The You're Wrong About podcast and Jessica Chastain talking about Jessica Hahn's story, they paint a really disturbing picture of this young woman manipulated and trapped.
And this was 1980,
Yeah.
long before the #MeToo movement.
Exactly. Speaking out against someone as powerful as Jim Bakker back then, it was unthinkable for someone like Hahn.
It's hard to even imagine. And the details that Hahn describes about Baker's behavior during and after the assault, they're just disturbing.
They are. The manipulation, the things he said to justify it, even him brushing his hair with her hairbrush after, it's like almost unbelievable.
It is, and it gets even worse. After Baker left the room, John Wesley Fletcher assaulted her too.
Yeah, it's just awful. And just hours later, they were back on PTL smiling, fundraising like nothing had happened.
It's sickening to think about this abuse happening behind the scenes of this supposedly wholesome Christian organization.
And it seems like Hahn wasn't their first victim either.
Really?
It points to a pattern of abuse that was enabled by their power, their celebrity, and a culture of silence within the church.
It's a lot to unpack. And the exploitation, it didn't stop there, did it? Hahn was pressured to sign a confession blaming herself for what happened.
Right, and she was paid hush money, but a lot of it ended up in the pockets of her own pastor, who was also abusive. And even later on, when she did her Playboy interview where she finally felt like she could tell her story, a lot of people saw it as more evidence that she was immoral.
It's tragic how the media focused on the so-called affair, but ignored the bigger issues. The financial fraud, the abuse of power,
Yeah.
the silencing of victims.
Absolutely. And Tammy Faye, even though she wasn't involved in the day-to-day stuff at PTL, she became the scapegoat.
How so?
The media, they made fun of her appearance or spending habits as if her love of makeup somehow made her responsible for her husband's crimes.
That's a classic example of misogyny.
It is. The
Yeah.
woman is always easier to blame, to mock, to dismiss.
Meanwhile, Jim Bakker, he served a reduced sentence for financial crimes, and then he came out and started selling doomsday prepper gear.
It's crazy, right?
It adds insult to injury that he profited off the fear and anxiety he helped create.
We have to remember that Jessica Hahn was a victim in all of this. The idea that she brought down the Bakkers, it's just wrong. She was manipulated, silenced, her trauma was exploited.
Her story deserved to be told separately.
It did, with nuance and respect. It wasn't just a side note to the Bakker story, it was its own tragedy.
And her experience, as Chastain points out, it speaks to this bigger issue of how women are often caught in the middle of these scandals and their voices get lost.
Right, the Wall Street Journal called 1987 the year of the bimbo,
Wow.
which really captures that whole thing.
It does. Jessica Hahn, Fawn Hall, Donna Rice. These women's lives were turned into tabloid fodder. Their stories were twisted to protect powerful men.
And we see this same pattern today. In politics, entertainment, anywhere there's power dynamics at play. Sadly, the woman is often the first one to be blamed, the first one to be sacrificed.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But how quick we are to judge people, especially women in the public eye.
It really does. And why was Tammy Faye such an easy target? Was it the makeup, her personality, or was it something deeper?
That's a good question. Maybe people were afraid of how open she was with her emotions and how she challenged what everyone thought a Christian woman should be.
She didn't fit the mold at all.
Not one bit. She was a walking contradiction to how a lot of people saw conservative Christianity.
And in a world that often values cynicism over sincerity, her genuine warmth could easily be seen as fake.
And her tears just dismissed as part of the show.
Exactly.
Jessica Chastain mentioned feeling a sense of guilt about Tammy Faye because she grew up watching those SNL skits and reading all the tabloid headlines.
Right.
It's like she was trying to reclaim Tammy Faye's story. Understand the real woman behind all that.
That's what's so powerful about digging deeper into these stories. You start to see the complexity, the humanity that gets lost when we judge too quickly.
You see that Tammy Faye, with all her flaws, she really just wanted to be loved. And she tried to create a space where everyone felt accepted and belonged, even when it went against what her own religion taught.
And even as her world was falling apart, cancer, divorce, her empire crumbling, she never stopped preaching that message of love.
I remember her last interview with Larry King, just hours before she died. It was incredible. Really showed her strength and spirit.
She was a fighter, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
It was like she was saying, you can judge me, you can make fun of me, but you can't take away my faith or my love.
Powerful stuff. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from the whole Bakker story. Beyond the scandal, the headlines, the rise and fall, there were real people struggling with faith and ambition, all the messiness of being human.
It's a reminder to look past the surface.
Yeah.
You know? Challenge what we think we know. And approach these stories with a little bit of empathy. Try to see the world through someone else's eyes.
Because like Tammy Faye said, we're all just people trying to find our way.
Well said. What a story. It really gives you a lot to think about. Did Tammy Faye get a fair shake? How does the media shape our perceptions? Especially when it comes to women.
Important questions. Questions we should keep asking.
We hope you'll keep thinking about them long after this deep dive ends. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.